also known as the Ramadan War, the October War, the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, or the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, was an armed conflict fought from October 6 to 25, 1973, between Israel and a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria. The majority of combat between the two sides took place in the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, both of which were occupied by Israel in 1967, with some fighting in African Egypt and northern Israel. Egypt's initial objective in the war was to seize a foothold on the eastern bank of the Suez Canal and subsequently leverage these gains to negotiate the return of the rest of the Israeli-occupied Sinai Peninsula. The war began on October 6, 1973, when the Arab coalition jointly launched a surprise attack against Israel on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, which had occurred during the 10th of the Islamic holy month of Ramadan in that year. Following the outbreak of hostilities, both the United States and the Soviet Union initiated massive resupply efforts to their allies, Israel and the Arab states respectively, during the war, which led to a confrontation between the two nuclear-armed superpowers. Fighting commenced when Egyptian and Syrian forces crossed their corresponding ceasefire lines with Israel and entered the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal in Operation Badr and advanced into the Sinai Peninsula. The Syrians launched a coordinated attack in the Golan Heights to coincide with the Egyptian offensive and initially made gains into Israeli-held territory. After 3 days of heavy fighting, Israel halted the Egyptian offensive, resulting in a military stalemate on that front, and pushed the Syrians back to the pre-war ceasefire lines. The Israeli military then launched a 4-day-long counteroffensive deep into Syria, and within a week, Israeli artillery began to shell the outskirts of the Syrian capital of Damascus. Egyptian forces meanwhile pushed for 2 strategic mountain passes deeper within the Sinai Peninsula, but were repulsed, and Israeli forces counterattacked by crossing the Suez Canal into Egypt and advancing towards Suez City. On October 22nd, an initial ceasefire brokered by the United Nations unraveled, with each side blaming the other for the breach. By October 24th, the Israelis had improved their positions considerably and completed their encirclement of the Egyptian Third Army in Suez City, bringing them within 100 kilometers, 62 miles, of the Egyptian capital of Cairo. This development led to dangerously heightened tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, and a second ceasefire was imposed cooperatively on October 25, 1973, to officially end the war. The Yom Kippur War had far-reaching implications. The Arab world had experienced humiliation in the lopsided rout of the Egyptian-Syrian-Jordanian alliance in 1967, but felt psychologically vindicated by early successes in the 1973 conflict. The Israelis recognized that despite impressive operational and tactical achievements on the battlefield, there was no guarantee that they would always dominate the Arab states militarily, as they had done consistently throughout the First, Second, and Third Arab-Israeli Wars. These changes paved the way for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. The 1978 Camp David Accords that followed the war saw Israel return the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and the subsequent 1979 Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty, which marked the first instance of an Arab country recognizing Israel as a legitimate state. Following the achievement of peace with Israel, Egypt continued its drift away from the Soviet Union and eventually left the Soviet sphere of influence entirely.
Two years later, at a military display in Cairo, Islamic extremists assassinated Anwar Sadat.
جئت إليكم اليوم على قدمين ثابتتين.
The war was part of the Arab-Israeli conflict, an ongoing dispute that has included many battles and wars since the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. During the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel had captured Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, roughly half of Syria's Golan Heights, and the territories of the West Bank, which had been held by Jordan since 1948. On June 19, 1967, shortly after the Six-Day War, the Israeli government voted to return the Sinai to Egypt and the Golan Heights to Syria in exchange for a permanent peace settlement and a demilitarization of the returned territories. This decision was not made public at the time, nor was it conveyed to any Arab state. Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban has said that it was, but there seems to be no solid evidence to corroborate his claim. No formal peace proposal was made either directly or indirectly by Israel. The Americans, who were briefed of the cabinet's decision by Eban, were not asked to convey it to Cairo and Damascus as official peace proposals, nor were they given indications that Israel expected a reply. Eban also rejected the prospect of a mediated peace, insisting of the need for direct negotiations with the Arab governments. The Arab position, as it emerged in September 1967 at the Khartoum Arab Summit, was to reject any peaceful settlement with the State of Israel. The 8 participating states, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, Kuwait, and Sudan, passed a resolution that would later become known as the 3 No's. There would be no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation with Israel. Prior to that, King Hussein of Jordan had stated that he could not rule out a possibility of a real, permanent peace between Israel and the Arab states.
This is an honorable peace, a balanced peace, a peace that will last.
Armed hostilities continued on a limited scale after the Six-Day War and escalated into the War of Attrition, an attempt to wear down the Israeli position through long-term pressure. In December 1970, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat had signaled in an interview with the New York Times that in return for a total withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, he was ready to recognize the rights of Israel as an independent state as defined by the Security Council of the United Nations. Swedish diplomat Gunnar Jarring coincidentally proposed a similar initiative 4 days later, on February 8, 1971. Egypt responded by accepting much of Jarring's proposals, though differing on several issues regarding the Gaza Strip, for example, and expressed its willingness to reach an accord if it also implemented the provisions of United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. This was the first time an Arab government had gone public declaring its readiness to sign a peace agreement with Israel. Golda Meir reacted to the overture by forming a committee to examine the proposal and vet possible concessions. When the committee unanimously concluded that Israel's interests would be served by full withdrawal to the internationally recognized lines dividing Israel from Egypt and Syria, returning the Gaza Strip, and, in a majority view, returning most of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Golda Meir was angered and shelved the document. The United States was infuriated by the cool Israeli response to Egypt's proposal, and Joseph Sisco informed Yitzhak Rabin that Israel would be regarded responsible for rejecting the best opportunity to reach peace since the establishment of the state. Israel responded to Jarring's plan also on February 26 by outlining its readiness to make some form of withdrawal, while declaring it had no intention of returning to the pre-June 5, 1967 lines. Explicating the response, Eban told the Knesset that the pre-June 5, 1967 lines cannot assure Israel against aggression. Jarring was disappointed and blamed Israel for refusing to accept a complete pullout from the Sinai Peninsula. The U.S. considered Israel an ally in the Cold War and had been supplying the Israeli military since the 1960s. Henry Kissinger believed that the regional balance of power hinged on maintaining Israel's military dominance over Arab countries, and that an Arab victory in the region would strengthen Soviet influence. Britain's position, on the other hand, was that war between the Arabs and Israelis could only be prevented by the implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 and a return to the pre-1967 boundaries. Sadat also had important domestic concerns in wanting war. The 3 years since Sadat had taken office were the most demoralized in Egyptian history. A desiccated economy added to the nation's despondency. War was a desperate option. Almost a full year before the war, in a meeting on October 24, 1972, with his Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, Sadat declared his intention to go to war with Israel even without proper Soviet support.
Is now inevitable. Whatever the price, whatever the sacrifice, we will not back down. We will not give up 1 centimeter of Arab land.
4 months before the war broke out, Henry Kissinger made an offer to Ismail, Sadat's emissary. Kissinger proposed returning the Sinai Peninsula to Egyptian control and an Israeli withdrawal from all of Sinai, except for some strategic points. Ismail said he would return with Sadat's reply, but never did. Sadat was already determined to go to war. Only an American guarantee that the United States would fulfill the entire Arab program in a brief time could have dissuaded Sadat. Sadat declared that Egypt was prepared to sacrifice 1 million Egyptian soldiers to recover its lost territory. From the end of 1972, Egypt began a concentrated effort to build up its forces, receiving MiG-21 jet fighters, SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, and SAW-7 anti-aircraft missiles, T-55 and T-62 tanks, RPG-7 anti-tank weapons, and the AT-3 Sagar anti-tank guided missile from the Soviet Union, and improving its military tactics based on Soviet battlefield doctrines. Political generals, who had in large part been responsible for the rout in 1967, were replaced with competent ones. The Soviets thought little of Sadat's chances in any war. They warned that any attempt to cross the heavily fortified Suez Canal would incur massive losses. Both the Soviets and Americans were at that time pursuing détente and had no interest in seeing the Middle East destabilized. In a June 1973 meeting with American President Richard Nixon, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev said that if Israel did not, we will have difficulty keeping the military situation from flaring up, an indication that the Soviet Union had been unable to restrain Sadat's plans. Between May and August 1973, the Egyptian army conducted military exercises near the border, and Ashraf Marwan inaccurately warned that Egypt and Syria would launch a surprise attack in the middle of May. The Israeli army mobilized with their blue-white alert in response to both the warnings and exercises at considerable cost. These exercises led some Israelis to dismiss the actual war preparations and Marwan's warning right before the attack was launched as another exercise. In the week leading up to Yom Kippur, the Egyptian army staged a week-long training exercise adjacent to the Suez Canal. Israeli intelligence, detecting large troop movements towards the canal, dismissed them as mere training exercises. Movements of Syrian troops towards the border were also detected, as were the cancellation of leaves and a call-up of reserves in the Syrian army. These activities were considered puzzling, but these forces were to prove critical during the early days of the war. On September 27th to 30, 2 batches of reservists were called up by the Egyptian army to participate in these exercises. 2 days before the outbreak of the war, on October 4th, the Egyptian command publicly announced the demobilization of part of the reservists called up during September 27th to lull Israeli suspicions. Around 20,000 troops were demobilized, and subsequently some of these men were given leave to perform the Umrah pilgrimage to Mecca, according to Egyptian General El Ghamasi. On the initiative of the operations staff, we reviewed the situation on the ground and developed a framework for the planned offensive operation. We studied the technical characteristics of the Suez Canal, the ebb and the flow of the tides, the speed of the currents and their direction, hours of darkness and of moonlight, weather conditions, and related conditions in the Mediterranean and Red Sea. He explained further by saying, Saturday the 6th of October 1973, 10 Ramadan 1393, was the day chosen for the September to October option. Conditions for a crossing were good, it was a fast day in Israel, and the moon on that day, 10 Ramadan, shone from sunset until midnight. The war coincided that year with the Muslim month of Ramadan, when many Muslim soldiers fast. On the other hand, the fact that the attack was launched on Yom Kippur may have helped Israel to more easily marshal reserves from their homes and synagogues because roads and communication lines were largely open, easing the mobilization and transportation of the military. Despite refusing to participate, King Hussein of Jordan had met with Sadat and Assad in Alexandria 2 weeks before. Given the mutual suspicions prevailing among the Arab leaders, it was unlikely that he had been told any specific war plans, but it was probable that Sadat and Assad had raised the prospect of war against Israel in more general terms to feel out the likelihood of Jordan joining in. On the night of September 25th, Hussein secretly flew to Tel Aviv to warn Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir of an impending Syrian attack. "Are they going to war without the Egyptians?" asked Mrs. Meir. The king said he didn't think so. "I think Egypt would cooperate." This warning was ignored, and Israeli intelligence indicated that the king had not told anything that was not already known. Throughout September, Israel received 11 warnings of war from well-placed sources. However, Mossad Director General Zvi Zamir continued to insist that war was not an Arab option, even after Hussein's warning. Zamir would later remark that, "We simply didn't feel them capable of war." On the day before the war, General Ariel Sharon was shown aerial photographs and other intelligence by Yehoshua Sagai, his divisional intelligence officer. General Sharon noticed that the concentration of Egyptian forces along the canal was far beyond anything observed during the training exercises, and that the Egyptians had amassed all of their crossing equipment along the canal. He then called General Shmuel Gonen, who had replaced him as head of Southern Command, and expressed his certainty that war was imminent. Zamir's concern grew on October 4 to 5 as additional signs of an impending attack were detected. Soviet advisors and their families left Egypt and Syria. Transport aircraft, thought to be laden with military equipment, landed in Cairo and Damascus, and aerial photographs revealed that Egyptian and Syrian concentrations of tanks, infantry, and surface-to-air SAM missiles were at an unprecedented high. According to declassified documents from the Agranat Commission, Brigadier General Yisrael Lior, Prime Minister Golda Meir's military secretary attaché, claimed that Mossad knew from Ashraf Marwan that an attack was going to occur under the guise of a military drill a week before it occurred. But the process of passing along the information to the Prime Minister's office failed. On the night of October 5 to 6, Marwan incorrectly informed Zamir that a joint Syrian-Egyptian attack would take place at sunset. It was this warning in particular, combined with the large number of other warnings, that finally goaded the Israeli High Command into action. Just hours before the attack began, orders went out for a partial call-up of the Israeli reserves. Prime Minister Golda Meir, Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan, and Chief of General Staff David Elazar met at 8:05 a.m. on the morning of Yom Kippur, 6 hours before the war began. Elazar proposed a mobilization of the entire Air Force in 4 armored divisions, or 100,000 to 120,000 troops, while Dayan favored a mobilization of the Air Force in 2 armored divisions, or around 70,000 troops. Golda Meir chose Elazar's proposal. Elazar argued in favor of a preemptive attack against Syrian airfields at noon, Syrian missiles at 3 p.m., and Syrian ground forces at 5 p.m. When the presentations were done, the Prime Minister hemmed uncertainly for a few moments, but then came to a clear decision. There would be no preemptive strike. Israel might be needing American assistance soon, and it was imperative that it would not be blamed for starting the war. "If we strike first, we won't get help from anybody," Golda Meir said. Prior to the war, Kissinger and Nixon consistently warned Golda Meir that she must not be responsible for initiating a Middle East war. And on October 6, 1973, Kissinger sent a further dispatch discouraging a preemptive strike. Israel was totally dependent on the United States for military resupply and sensitive to anything that might endanger that relationship. At 10:15 a.m., Meir met with American Ambassador Kenneth Keating to inform him that Israel did not intend to preemptively start a war and asked that American efforts be directed at preventing war. Kissinger urged the Soviets to use their influence to prevent war, contacted Egypt with Israel's message of non-preemption, and sent messages to other Arab governments to enlist their help on the side of moderation. These late efforts were futile. According to Henry Kissinger, had Israel struck first, it would not have received so much as a nail. The war began on October 6, 1973, when the Arab coalition jointly launched a surprise attack against Israel on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, which had occurred during the 10th of the Islamic holy month of Ramadan in that year. The attack by the Egyptian and Syrian forces caught the United States by surprise. According to future CIA Director and Defense Secretary Robert Gates, he was briefing an American arms negotiator on the improbability of armed conflict in the region when he heard the news of the outbreak of war on the radio. On the other hand, the KGB learned about the attack in advance, probably from its intelligence sources in Egypt. Egypt's initial war objective was to use its military to seize a limited amount of Israeli-occupied Sinai on the east bank of the Suez Canal. This would provoke a crisis which would allow it to bring American and Soviet pressure to bear on Israel. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's publicly stated position was to recover all Arab territory occupied by Israel following the 1967 war and to achieve a just, peaceful solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Similarly, Syria intended to seize back some or all of the Golan and to then negotiate its retention via great power pressure. Both Egypt and Syria expected that the use of the oil weapon would assist them in post-conflict negotiations once their attacks had generated a reason for its use. Other than a flurry of Syrian missile attacks on Ramat David Air Base and surrounding civilian settlements during the first days of the war, the fighting took place in Sinai and the Golan Heights, territories that had been occupied by Israel since their victory in the Six-Day War of 1967, and in the later stages, on the west side of the Suez Canal in Egypt, and in areas of the Golan beyond those held by Israel prior to the outbreak of war. The Egyptians had prepared for an assault across the canal and deployed 5 divisions totaling 100,000 soldiers, 1,350 tanks, and 2,000 guns and heavy mortars for the onslaught. Facing them were 450 soldiers of the Jerusalem Brigade, spread out in 16 forts along the length of the canal. There were 290 Israeli tanks in all of Sinai, divided into 3 armored brigades, only one of which was deployed near the canal when hostilities commenced. Large bridgeheads were established on the east bank on October 6th. Israeli armored forces launched counterattacks from October 6th to 8, but they were often piecemeal and inadequately supported and were beaten back principally by Egyptians using portable anti-tank missiles. Between October 9th and 12th, the American response was a call for a ceasefire in place. The Egyptian units generally would not advance beyond a shallow strip for fear of losing the protection of their sand batteries, which were situated on the west bank of the canal. In the Six-Day War, the Israeli Air Force had pummeled the defenseless Arab armies. This time, Egypt had heavily fortified their side of the ceasefire lines with sand batteries provided by the Soviet Union. On October 9th, The Israel Defense Forces chose to concentrate its reserves and build up its supplies, while the Egyptians remained on the strategic defensive. Nixon and Kissinger held back on a full-scale resupply of arms to Israel. Short of supplies, the Israeli government reluctantly accepted a ceasefire in place on October 12, but Sadat refused to do so. The Soviets started an airlift of arms to Syria and Egypt. The American global interest was to prove that Soviet arms could not dictate the outcome of the fighting by supplying Israel. With an airlift in full swing, Washington was prepared to wait until Israeli success on the battlefield might persuade the Arabs and the Soviets to bring the fighting to an end. The Israelis decided to counterattack once Egyptian armor attempted to expand the bridgehead beyond the protective SAM umbrella. The riposte, codenamed Operation Gazelle, was launched on October 15th. Israel Defense Forces spearheaded by Ariel Sharon's division broke through the Tassa corridor and crossed the Suez Canal to the north of the Great Bitter Lake. After intense fighting, the Israel Defense Forces progressed towards Cairo and advanced southwards on the east bank of the Great Bitter Lake and in the southern extent of the canal right up to Port Suez. Israeli progress towards Cairo was brought to a halt by a fresh ceasefire on October 24th. Anticipating a swift Israeli armored counterattack by 3 armored divisions, the Egyptians had armed their assault force with large numbers of man-portable anti-tank weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and the less numerous but more advanced Sagar-guided missiles, which proved devastating to the first Israeli armored counterattacks. Each of the 5 infantry divisions that were to cross the canal had been equipped with RPG-7 rockets and RPG-43 grenades, and reinforced with an anti-tank guided missile battalion, as they would not have any armor support for nearly 12 hours. In addition, the Egyptians had built separate ramps at the crossing points, reaching as high as 21 meters, to counter the Israeli sand wall, provide covering fire for the assaulting infantry, and to counter the first Israeli armored counterattacks. The Egyptian army put great effort into finding a quick and effective way of breaching the Israeli defenses. The Israelis had built large 18-meter-high sand walls with a 60-degree slope and reinforced with concrete at the waterline. Egyptian engineers initially experimented with explosive charges and bulldozers to clear the obstacles, before a junior officer proposed using high-pressure water cannons. The idea was tested and found to be a sound one, and several high-pressure water cannons were imported from Britain and East Germany. The water cannons effectively breached the sand walls using water from the canal. At 2 p.m. on October 6th, Operation Badr began with a large airstrike. More than 200 Egyptian aircraft conducted simultaneous strikes against 3 air bases, Hawk missile batteries, 3 command centers, artillery positions, and several radar installations. Airfields at Refidim and Bir Tamata were temporarily put out of service, and damage was inflicted on a Hawk battery at Ophir. The aerial assault was coupled with a barrage from more than 2,000 artillery pieces for a period of 53 minutes against the Bar Lev line and rear area command posts and concentration bases. Author Andrew McGregor claimed that the success of the first strike negated the need for a second planned strike. Egypt acknowledged the loss of 5 aircraft during the attack. Kenneth Pollock wrote that 18 Egyptian aircraft were shot down, and that these losses prompted the cancellation of the second planned wave. In one notable engagement during this period, a pair of Israeli F-4E Phantoms challenged 28 Egyptian MiGs over Sharm el-Sheikh, and within half an hour shot down 7 or 8 MiGs with no losses. One of the Egyptian pilots killed was Captain Atef Sadat, President Sadat's half-brother. Simultaneously, 14 Egyptian Tupolev Tu-16 bombers attacked Israeli targets in the Sinai with Kelt missiles, while another 2 Egyptian Tupolevs fired 2 Kelt missiles at a radar station in central Israel. One missile was shot down by a patrolling Israeli Mirage fighter, and the second fell into the sea. The attack was an attempt to warn Israel that Egypt could retaliate if it bombed targets deep within Egyptian territory. Under cover of the initial artillery barrage, the Egyptian assault force of 32,000 infantry began crossing the canal in 12 waves at 5 separate crossing areas from 1405 to 1730 in what became known as the crossing. The Egyptians prevented Israeli forces from reinforcing the Bar Lev line and proceeded to attack the Israeli fortifications. Meanwhile, engineers crossed over to breach the sand wall. The Israeli Air Force conducted air interdiction operations to try to prevent the bridges from being erected, but took losses from Egyptian sand batteries. The air attacks were ineffective overall, as the sectional design of the bridges enabled quick repairs when hit. Despite fierce resistance, the Israeli Reserve Brigade garrisoning the Bar Lev forts was overwhelmed. According to Shazli, within 6 hours, 15 strongpoints had been captured as Egyptian forces advanced several kilometers into the Sinai. Shazli's account was disputed by Kenneth Pollock, who noted that for the most part, the forts only fell to repeated assaults by superior forces or prolonged sieges over many days. The northernmost fortification of the Bar Lev line, codenamed Fort Budapest, withstood repeated assaults and remained in Israeli hands throughout the war. Once the bridges were laid, additional infantry with the remaining portable and recoilless anti-tank weapons. The Egyptians also attempted to land several heli-borne commando units in various areas in the Sinai to hamper the arrival of Israeli reserves. This attempt met with disaster as the Israelis shot down up to 20 helicopters, inflicting heavy casualties. Israeli Major General Chaim Herzog placed Egyptian helicopter losses at 14. Other sources claim that several helicopters were down with total loss of life, and that the few commandos that did filter through were ineffectual and presented nothing more than a nuisance. Kenneth Pollock asserted that despite their heavy losses, the Egyptian commandos fought exceptionally hard and created considerable panic, prompting the Israelis to take precautions that hindered their ability to concentrate on stopping the assault across the canal. Egyptian forces advanced approximately 4 to 5 kilometers into the Sinai Desert with 2 armies, both corps-sized by Western standards, included the 2nd Infantry Division in the Northern 2nd Army. By the following morning, some 850 tanks had crossed the canal. In his account of the war, Saad el-Shazli noted that by the morning of October 7th, the Egyptians had lost 280 soldiers and 20 tanks. Most Israeli soldiers defending the Bar Lev line became casualties, and some 200 were taken prisoner. In the subsequent days, some defenders of the Bar Lev line managed to break through the Egyptian encirclement and return to their lines, or were extracted during later Israeli counterattacks. For the next several days, the IAF played a minimal role in the fighting, largely because it was needed to deal with the simultaneous and ultimately more threatening Syrian attack in the Golan Heights. Egyptian forces then consolidated their initial positions. On October 7th, the bridgeheads were enlarged an additional 4 kilometers, at the same time repulsing Israeli counterattacks. In the north, the Egyptian 18th Division attacked the town of El-Kantara el-Sharqiya, engaging Israeli forces in and around the town. The fighting there was conducted at close quarters and was sometimes hand-to-hand. The Egyptians were forced to clear the town building by building. By evening, most of the town was in Egyptian hands. El-Kantara was completely cleared by the next morning. Meanwhile, the Egyptian commandos airdropped on October 6th began encountering Israeli reserves the following morning. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but the commandos were at times successful in delaying the movement of Israeli reserves to the front. These special operations often led to confusion and anxiety among Israeli commanders who commended the Egyptian commandos. This view was contradicted by another source that stated that few commandos made it to their objectives and were usually nothing more than a nuisance. According to Abraham Rabinovich, only the commandos near Beluza and those blocking the road to Fort Budapest had measurable success. Of the 1,700 Egyptian commandos inserted behind Israeli lines during the war, 740 were killed, many in downed helicopters, and 330 taken prisoner. On October 7th, David Elazar visited Shmuel Gonen, commander of the Israeli Southern Command, who had only taken the position 3 months before at the retirement of Ariel Sharon, and met with Israeli commanders. The Israelis planned a cautious counterattack for the following day by Avraham Adan's 162nd Armored Division. The same day, the Israeli Air Force carried out Operation Tagar, aiming to neutralize Egyptian Air Force bases and its missile defense shield. 7 Egyptian air bases were damaged, with the loss of 2 A-4 Skyhawks and their pilots. 2 more planned attacks were called off because of the increasing need for air power on the Syrian front. The Israeli Air Force carried out additional air attacks against Egyptian forces on the east bank of the canal, reportedly inflicting heavy losses. Israeli jets had carried out hundreds of sorties against Egyptian targets by the following day. But the Egyptian SAM shield, the Israelis responded by rapidly devising new tactics to thwart the Egyptian air defenses. On October 8th, after Elazar had left, Gonen changed the plans on the basis of unduly optimistic field reports. Adan's division was composed of 3 brigades totaling 183 tanks. One of the brigades was still en route to the area and would participate in the attack by noon, along with a supporting mechanized infantry brigade with an additional 44 tanks. The Israeli counterattack was in the direction of the Bar Lev strongpoints opposite the city of Ismailia, against entrenched Egyptian infantry. In a series of ill-coordinated attacks which were met by stiff resistance from Egyptian tanks, artillery, and infantry, armed with anti-tank rockets, the Israelis were repulsed with heavy losses. An initial Israeli attack by some 25 tanks broke through the first Egyptian troops and managed to come within 800 meters of the canal before coming under withering fire. The Israelis lost 18 tanks within minutes, and most of the Egyptians allowed the Israelis to advance and then encircled them in a prepared kill zone before opening fire, wiping out most of the Israeli force within 13 minutes. The Egyptians destroyed 50 Israeli tanks and captured 8 intact. That afternoon, Egyptian forces advanced once more to deepen their bridgeheads, and as a result the Israelis lost several strategic positions. Further Israeli attacks to regain the lost ground proved futile. Towards nightfall, an Egyptian counterattack was repulsed with the loss of 50 Egyptian tanks by the Israeli 143rd Armored Division, which was led by Ariel Sharon, who had been reinstated as a division commander at the outset of the war. Garwich, citing Egyptian sources, documented Egyptian tank losses up to October 13th at 240.
According to Herzog, by October 9th the front lines had stabilized. The Egyptians were unable to advance further, and Egyptian armored attacks on October 9 and 10 were repulsed with heavy losses. However, this claim was disputed by Shazli, who claimed that the Egyptians continued to advance and improve their positions well into October 10. He pointed to one engagement, which involved elements of the 1st Infantry Brigade, attached to the 19th Division, which captured Ayun Musa, south of Suez. The Egyptian 1st Mechanized Brigade launched a failed attack southward along the Gulf of Suez in the direction of Ras Sudar. Leaving the safety of the SAM umbrella, the force was attacked by Israeli aircraft and suffered heavy losses. Between October 10 and 13, both sides refrained from any large-scale actions, and the situation was relatively stable. Both sides launched small-scale attacks, and the Egyptians used helicopters to land commandos behind Israeli lines. Some Egyptian helicopters were shot down, and those commando forces that managed to land were quickly destroyed by Israeli troops. In one key engagement on October 13, a particularly large Egyptian incursion was stopped and close to 100 Egyptian commandos were killed. On October 14, an engagement now known as the Battle of the Sinai took place. In preparation for the attack, Egyptian helicopters set down 100 commandos near the lateral road to disrupt the Israeli rear. An Israeli reconnaissance unit quickly subdued them, killing 60 and taking numerous prisoners. Still bruised by the extensive losses their commandos had suffered on the opening day of the war, the Egyptians were unable or unwilling to implement further commando operations that had been planned in conjunction with the armored attack. General Shazli strongly opposed any eastward advance that would leave his armor without adequate air cover. He was overruled by General Ismail and Sadat, whose aims were to seize the strategic Mitla and GD passes and the Israeli nerve center at Rephidim, which they hoped would relieve pressure on the Syrians by forcing Israel to shift divisions from the Golan to the Sinai. The 2nd and 3rd Armies were ordered to attack eastward in 6 simultaneous thrusts over a broad front, leaving behind 5 infantry divisions to hold the bridgeheads. The attacking forces, consisting of 801,000 tanks, would not have SAM cover, so the Egyptian Air Force, EAF, was tasked with their defense against Israeli aerial attacks. Armored and mechanized units initiated the attack on October 14 with artillery support. They were up against 700 to 750 Israeli tanks. In the event, the Egyptian armored thrust suffered heavy losses. Instead of concentrating forces of maneuvering, except for the Wadi thrust, Egyptian units launched head-on attacks against the waiting Israeli defenses. At least 250 Egyptian tanks and some 200 armored vehicles were destroyed. Egyptian casualties exceeded 1,000. Fewer than 40 Israeli tanks were hit, and all but 6 of them were repaired by Israeli maintenance crews and returned to service, while Israeli casualties numbered 665. Kenneth Pollock credited a successful Israeli commando raid early on October 14 against an Egyptian signals intercept site at Jebel Ataka with seriously disrupting Egyptian command and control and contributing to its breakdown during the engagement. Israeli intelligence had also detected signs that the Egyptians were gearing up for a major armored thrust as early as October 12. At this point, General Sharon advocated an immediate crossing at Diversoir at the northern edge of Great Bitter Lake. Earlier, on October 9, a reconnaissance force attached to Colonel Amon Reshef's brigade had detected a gap between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd Armies in this sector. According to General Gamassi, the gap had been spotted by an American State Route 71 spy plane. The Israelis followed the Egyptian failed attack of October 14 with a multi-divisional counterattack through the gap between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd Armies. Sharon's 143rd Division, now reinforced with a paratroop brigade commanded by Colonel Danny Matt, was tasked with establishing bridgeheads on the east and west banks of the canal. The 162nd and 252nd Armored Divisions, commanded by Generals Abraham Adan and Kalman Megan, respectively, would then cross through the breach to the west bank of the canal and swing southward, encircling the 3rd Army. On the night of October 15, 750 of Colonel Matt's paratroopers crossed the canal in rubber dinghies. They were soon joined by tanks, ferried on motorized rafts, and additional infantry. The force encountered no resistance initially and fanned out in raiding parties, attacking supply convoys, SAM sites, logistic centers and anything else of military value, with priority given to the SAMs. Attacks on SAM sites punched a hole in the Egyptian anti-aircraft screen and enabled the Israeli Air Force to strike Egyptian ground targets more aggressively. On the night of October 15, 20 Israeli tanks and 7 APCs under the command of Colonel Hayam Erez crossed the canal and penetrated 12 kilometers into Egypt, taking the Egyptians by surprise. For the first 24 hours, Erez's force attacked SAM sites and military columns with impunity, including a major raid on Egyptian missile bases on October 16, in which 3 Egyptian missile bases were destroyed, along with several tanks, for no Israeli losses. On the morning of October 17, the force was attacked by the 23rd Egyptian Armored Brigade, but managed to repulse the attack. By this time, the Syrians no longer posed a credible threat and the Israelis were able to shift their air power to the south in support of the offensive. The combination of a weakened Egyptian SAM umbrella and a greater concentration of Israeli fighter bombers meant that the Israeli Air Force was capable of greatly increasing sorties against Egyptian military targets, including convoys, armor and airfields. The Egyptian bridges across the canal were damaged in Israeli air and artillery attacks. Israeli jets began attacking Egyptian SAM sites and radars, prompting General Ismail to withdraw much of the Egyptians' air defense equipment. This in turn gave the Israeli Air Force still greater freedom to operate in Egyptian airspace. Israeli jets also attacked and destroyed underground communication cables at Bana in the Nile Delta, forcing the Egyptians to transmit selective messages by radio, which could be intercepted. Aside from the cables at Bana, Israel refrained from attacking economic and strategic infrastructure following an Egyptian threat to retaliate against Israeli cities with Scud missiles. Israeli aircraft bombed Egyptian Scud batteries at port said several times. The Egyptian Air Force attempted to interdict Israeli Air Force sorties and attack Israeli ground forces, but suffered heavy losses in dogfights and from Israeli air defenses, while inflicting light aircraft losses. The heaviest air battles took place over the northern Nile Delta, where the Israelis repeatedly attempted to destroy Egyptian airbases. Although the Israelis tended to come out on top in aerial battles, one notable exception was the air battle of Mansoura, when an Israeli raid against the Egyptian airbases of Tanta and Mansoura was repulsed by Egyptian fighter aircraft. Despite the success the Israelis were having on the West Bank, Generals Bar-Lev and Elazar ordered Sharon to concentrate on securing the bridgehead on the East Bank. He was ordered to clear the roads leading to the canal as well as a position known as the Chinese Farm, just north of Deversoir, the Israeli crossing point. Sharon objected and requested permission to expand and break out of the bridgehead on the West Bank, arguing that such a maneuver would cause the collapse of Egyptian forces on the East Bank. But the Israeli High Command was insistent, believing that until the East Bank was secure, forces on the West Bank could be cut off. Sharon was overruled by his superiors and relented. On October 16, he dispatched Amon Reshef's brigade to attack the Chinese Farm. Other Israel Defense Forces attacked entrenched Egyptian forces overlooking the roads to the canal. After 3 days of bitter and close-quarters fighting, the Israelis succeeded in dislodging the numerically superior Egyptian forces. The Israelis lost about 300 dead, 1,000 wounded, and 56 tanks. The Egyptians suffered heavier casualties, including 118 tanks destroyed and 15 captured. The Egyptians, meanwhile, failed to grasp the extent and magnitude of the Israeli crossing, nor did they appreciate its intent and purpose. This was partly due to attempts by Egyptian field commanders to obfuscate reports concerning the Israeli crossing and partly due to a false assumption that the canal crossing was merely a diversion for a major Israel Defense Forces offensive targeting the right flank of the Second Army. Consequently, on October 16 General Shazli ordered the 21st Armored Division to attack southward and the T-62 equipped 25th Independent Armored Brigade to attack northward in a pincer action to eliminate the perceived threat to the Second Army. The Egyptians failed to scout the area and were unaware that by now, Adan's 162nd Armored Division was in the vicinity. Moreover, the 21st and 25th failed to coordinate their attacks, allowing General Adan's division to meet each force separately. Adan first concentrated his attack on the 21st Armored Division, destroying 50 to 60 Egyptian tanks and forcing the remainder to retreat. He then turned southward and ambushed the 25th Independent Armored Brigade, destroying 86 of its 96 tanks and all of its APCs, while losing 3 tanks. Egyptian artillery shelled the Israeli bridge over the canal on the morning of October 17, scoring several hits. The Egyptian Air Force launched repeated raids, some with up to 20 aircraft, to take out the bridge and rafts, damaging the bridge. The Egyptians had to shut down their SAM sites during these raids, allowing Israeli fighters to intercept the Egyptians. The Egyptians lost 16 planes and 7 helicopters, while the Israelis lost 6 planes. The bridge was damaged, and the Israeli paratroop headquarters, which was near the bridge, was also hit. Its commander and his deputy were wounded. During the night, the bridge was repaired, but only a trickle of Israeli forces was able to cross. According to Chaim Herzog, the Egyptians continued attacking the bridgehead until the ceasefire, using artillery and mortars to fire tens of thousands of shells into the area of the crossing. Egyptian aircraft attempted to bomb the bridge every day, and helicopters launched suicide missions, making attempts to drop barrels of napalm on the bridge and bridgehead. The bridges were damaged multiple times, and had to be repaired at night. The attacks caused heavy casualties, and many tanks were sunk when their rafts were hit. Egyptian commandos and frogmen with armored support launched a ground attack against the bridgehead, which was repulsed with the loss of 10 tanks. 2 subsequent Egyptian counterattacks were also beaten back. After the failure of the October 17 counterattacks, the Egyptian General Staff slowly began to realize the magnitude of the Israeli offensive. Early on October 18, the Soviets showed Sadat satellite imagery of Israeli forces operating on the West Bank. Alarmed, Sadat dispatched Shazli to the front to assess the situation firsthand. He no longer trusted his field commanders to provide accurate reports. Shazli confirmed that the Israelis had at least 1 division on the West Bank and were widening their bridgehead. He advocated withdrawing most of Egypt's armor from the East Bank to confront the growing Israeli threat on the West Bank. Sadat rejected this recommendation outright and even threatened Shazli with a court-martial. Ahmad Ismail Ali recommended that Sadat push for a ceasefire so as to prevent the Israelis from exploiting their successes. Israeli forces were by now pouring across the canal on 2 bridges, including one of Israeli design, and motorized rafts. Israeli engineers under Brigadier General Dan even had worked under heavy Egyptian fire to set up the bridges, and over 100 were killed and hundreds more wounded. The crossing was difficult because of Egyptian artillery fire, though by 4 a.m., 2 of Adan's brigades were on the west bank of the canal. On the morning of October 18, Sharon's forces on the West Bank launched an offensive toward Ismailia, slowly pushing back the Egyptian paratroop brigade occupying the sand rampart northward to enlarge the bridgehead. Some of his units attempted to move west, but were stopped at the crossroads in Nephalia. Adan's division rolled south toward Suez City while Magan's division pushed west toward Cairo and south toward Adabiyah. On October 19, one of Sharon's brigades continued to push the Egyptian paratroopers north towards Ismailia until the Israelis were within 8 or 10 kilometers of the city. Sharon hoped to seize the city and thereby sever the logistical and supply lines for most of the Egyptian Second Army. Sharon's 2nd Brigade began to cross the canal. The brigade's forward elements moved to the Abu Sultan camp, from where they moved north to take Orcha, an Egyptian logistics base defended by a commando battalion. Israeli infantrymen cleared the trenches and bunkers, often engaging in hand-to-hand combat, as tanks moved alongside them and fired into the trench sections to their front. The position was secured before nightfall. More than 300 Egyptians were killed and 50 taken prisoner, while the Israelis lost 16 dead. The fall of Orcha caused the collapse of the Egyptian defensive line, allowing more Israeli troops to get onto the sand rampart. There, they were able to fire in support of Israeli troops facing Missouri Ridge, an Egyptian-occupied position on the Bar Lev line that could pose a threat to the Israeli crossing. On the same day, Israeli paratroopers participating in Sharon's drive pushed the Egyptians back far enough for the Israeli bridges to be out of sight of Egyptian artillery observers, though the Egyptians continued shelling the area. As the Israelis pushed towards Ismailia, the Egyptians fought a delaying battle, retreating into defensive positions further north as they came under increasing pressure from the Israeli ground offensive, coupled with airstrikes. On October 21, one of Sharon's brigades was occupying the city's outskirts, but facing fierce resistance from Egyptian paratroopers and commandos. The same day, Sharon's last remaining unit on the East Bank attacked Missouri Ridge. Shmuel Gonen had demanded Sharon capture the position, and Sharon had reluctantly ordered the attack. The assault was preceded by an air attack that caused hundreds of Egyptian soldiers to flee and thousands of others to dig in. One Israeli battalion then attacked from the south, destroying 20 tanks and overrunning infantry positions before being halted by Sagar missiles and minefields. Another battalion attacked from the southwest and inflicted heavy losses on the Egyptians, but its advance was halted after 8 tanks were knocked out. The surviving Israeli soldiers managed to hold off an Egyptian infantry assault while losing 2 soldiers before surrendering. 2 of the Israeli soldiers managed to hide and escape back to Israeli lines. The Israelis managed to occupy 1/3 of Missouri Ridge. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan countermanded orders from Sharon's superiors to continue the attack. However, the Israelis continued to expand their holdings on the East Bank. According to the Israelis, the Israel Defense Forces bridgehead was 40 kilometers wide and 32 kilometers deep by the end of October 21. On October 22, Ismailia's Egyptian defenders were occupying their last line of defense. At around 10 a.m., the Israelis renewed the attack, moving toward Jebel Maryam, Abu, Atwa and Nefisha. The paratroopers at Jebel Maryam became engaged in intense fighting but, with their advantageous position, were able to repel the attack by late afternoon. Meanwhile, the Israelis concentrated artillery and mortar fire against the Sa'ika positions at Abu, Atwa and Nefisha. At noon, advance Israeli elements engaged with a Sa'ika reconnaissance unit, and the Israelis lost 2 tanks and a half-track. At 1 p.m., an Israeli paratrooper company attacked Abu, Atwa without first scouting ahead, and was ambushed and annihilated. The attack ended after paratroopers suffered over 50 casualties and lost 4 tanks. At the same time, 2 tank companies and mechanized infantry attacked Nefisha, supported with close air support. The Egyptian Sa'ika Commando Battalion in charge of Nefisha managed to repel the attack after prolonged, heavy fighting that closed to very short distances. The Israelis lost 3 tanks, 2 half-tracks, and a large number of men. For their part, the Sa'ika commandos at Nefisha lost 24 killed, including 4 officers, and 42 wounded, including 3 officers. Edgar Obalance mentions a counterattack by the Sa'ika which took place during the afternoon and pushed some of Sharon's troops back along the Sweetwater Canal. The Israeli attack had been thoroughly routed. Israeli forces failed to get behind Ismailia and encircle the city. The Israeli advance on Ismailia was stopped 10 kilometers south of the city. The Israel Defense Forces failed to cut supplies for the Egyptian Second Army or to occupy Ismailia. The Egyptians registered a tactical and strategic victory in the defense of Ismailia, stopping an encirclement of their large forces on the east bank of the Suez Canal and ensuring their supply lines remained open. On the northern front, the Israelis also attacked Port Said, facing Egyptian troops and a 900-strong Tunisian unit, who fought a defensive battle. The Egyptian government claimed that the city was repeatedly bombed by Israeli jets, and that hundreds of civilians were killed or wounded. Adan and Megan moved south, decisively defeating the Egyptians in a series of engagements, though they often encountered determined Egyptian resistance, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. Adan advanced towards the Sweetwater Canal area, planning to break out into the surrounding desert and hit the Janifa Hills, where many SAM sites were located. Adan's 3 armored brigades fanned out, with one advancing through the Janifa Hills, another along a parallel road south of them, and the third advancing towards Mina. Adan's brigades met resistance from dug-in Egyptian forces in the Sweetwater Canal area's greenbelt. Adan's other brigades were also held by a line of Egyptian military camps and installations. Adan was also harassed by the Egyptian Air Force. The Israelis slowly advanced, bypassing Egyptian positions whenever possible. After being denied air support due to the presence of 2 SAM batteries that had been brought forward, Adan sent 2 brigades to attack them. The brigade slipped past the dug-in Egyptian infantry, moving out from the Greenbelt for more than 8 kilometers, and fought off multiple Egyptian counterattacks. From a distance of 4 kilometers, they shelled and destroyed the SAMs, allowing the Israeli Air Force to provide Adan with close air support. Adan's troops advanced through the Greenbelt and fought their way to the Janifa Hills, clashing with scattered Egyptian, Kuwaiti and Palestinian troops. The Israelis clashed with an Egyptian armored unit at Mitzaneft and destroyed multiple SAM sites. Adan also captured Faid Airport, which was subsequently prepared by Israeli crews to serve as a supply base and to fly out wounded soldiers. 16 kilometers west of the Bitter Lake, Colonel Natki Mir's brigade overran an Egyptian artillery brigade that had been participating in the shelling of the Israeli bridgehead. Scores of Egyptian artillerymen were killed and many more taken prisoner. 2 Israeli soldiers were also killed, including the son of General Moshe Gidron. Meanwhile, Magan's division moved west and then south, covering Adan's flank and eventually moving south of Suez City to the Gulf of Suez. The United Nations Security Council passed, 14-0, Resolution 338 calling for a ceasefire, largely negotiated between the US and Soviet Union, on October 22. It called upon the belligerents to immediately cease all military activity. The ceasefire was to come into effect 12 hours later at 6:52 p.m. Israeli time. Because this was after dark, it was impossible for satellite surveillance to determine where the front lines were when the fighting was supposed to stop. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger intimated to Prime Minister Mayer that he would not object to offensive action during the night before the ceasefire was to come into effect. Several minutes before the ceasefire came into effect, 3 Scud missiles were fired at Israeli targets by either Egyptian forces or Soviet personnel in Egypt. This was the first combat use of Scud missiles. 1 Scud targeted the port of Arish and 2 targeted the Israeli bridgehead on the Suez Canal. 1 hit an Israeli supply convoy and killed 7 soldiers. When the time for the ceasefire arrived, Sharon's division had failed to capture Ismailia and cut off the Second Army's supply lines, but Israeli forces were just a few hundred meters short of their southern goal, the last road linking Cairo and Suez. Adan's drive south had left Israeli and Egyptian units scattered throughout the battlefield, with no clear lines between them. As Egyptian and Israeli units tried to regroup, regular firefights broke out. During the night, Elazar reported that the Egyptians were attacking in an attempt to regain land at various locations, and that 9 Israeli tanks had been destroyed. He asked permission from Dayan to respond to the attacks and Dayan agreed. Israel then resumed its drive south. It is unclear which side fired first, but Israeli field commanders used the skirmishes as justification to resume the attacks. When Sadat protested alleged Israeli truce violations, Israel said that Egyptian troops had fired first. William B. Kwan noted that regardless of who fired the first post-ceasefire shot, it was the Israeli army that was advancing beyond the October 22 ceasefire lines. Adan resumed his attack on October 23. Israeli troops finished the drive south, captured the last ancillary road south of the port of Suez, and encircled the Egyptian Third Army east of the Suez Canal. The Israelis then transported enormous amounts of military equipment across the canal, which Egypt claimed was in violation of the ceasefire. Egyptian aircraft launched repeated attacks in support of the Third Army, sometimes in groups of up to 30 planes, but took severe losses. The Battle of Suez was fought on October 24–25, 1973 between the Israel Defense Forces and the Egyptian Army in the Egyptian town of Suez. It was the last major battle of the Yom Kippur War, before a ceasefire took effect. On October 23, with the imminent arrival of UN observers to the front, Israel decided to capture Suez, assuming it would be poorly defended. An armored brigade and an infantry battalion from the paratroopers brigade were committed to the task, and entered the city without a battle plan. The armored column was ambushed and severely hit, while the paratroopers came under heavy fire and many of them became trapped inside a local building. The armored column and part of the infantry force were evacuated during the day, while the main contingent of the paratrooper force eventually managed to dash out of the city and make their way back to Israeli lines. At 4 p.m. on Tuesday, October 23, the United Nations Security Council met in New York City to reconfirm the ceasefire and send observers to the fighting front. At 6 p.m., General Nco Sialavo, head of the UN Emergency Force in Cairo, called the Israeli Defense Minister, Moshe Dayan, and told him of the decision. Dayan suggested that the ceasefire go into effect at 7 a.m. local time, 36 hours after the original ceasefire was supposed to take effect, and Sialavo accepted. The Israeli Chief of Staff, David Elazar, said in the Kyria that he was in a dilemma. From a military perspective, the IDF needed a few more days to make the Egyptian Third Army surrender and cut off the Second Army, which would collapse the entire Egyptian military. On the other hand, Israel had a great debt to the United States as a result of the massive arms shipments of Operation Nickel Grass. He later said it was the latter consideration that made him accept the ceasefire. The town of Suez had about 260,000 residents before the War of Attrition, but most of them left during that conflict. However, there were enough men to form a militia, which would make up part of the city's defense force. On October 23, Division Commander Major General Avraham Adan had 3 armored brigades and a makeshift infantry brigade made up of 5 or 6 battalions. By October 24, Israel had 2 brigades on the outskirts of the city, and 1 battalion from Yoff's paratroopers brigade southwest of the town at the Gulf of Suez near the old oil refinery. Suez was thus completely isolated from Egypt from the west, and so was most of the Third Army. Yoff had pushed across the Sereg Road west of Suez, but a further blocked the Egyptians. Capturing Suez was not considered psychologically or strategically important, although it was presumed to hold supplies for the Third Army. Throughout October 22 to 23, many Egyptian officers and soldiers had withdrawn into Suez. Most of these belonged to administrative and supply units that had been stationed on the west bank of the canal. They also contained a number of units from Third Army that had been engaging Israeli forces since October 16. The number of Egyptian forces inside Suez reached almost 5,000 men, possessing only small arms and assault rifles. Brigadier General Yusuf Afifi, commanding the 19th Infantry Division east of the canal, reinforced the city with an ATGM company and a tank hunting team. On its way to Suez, the company had expended its missiles in an engagement with Israeli tanks, destroying more than 9 tanks. This left Egyptian forces in the city with a small number of RPG-7 weapons and RPG-43 grenades. Kissinger found out about the Third Army's encirclement shortly thereafter. Kissinger considered that the situation presented the United States with a tremendous opportunity and that Egypt was dependent on the United States to prevent Israel from destroying its trapped army. The position could be parlayed later into allowing the United States to mediate in the dispute and wean Egypt from Soviet influence. As a result, the United States exerted tremendous pressure on the Israelis to refrain from destroying the trapped army, even threatening to support a UN resolution demanding that the Israelis withdraw to their October 22 positions if they did not allow non-military supplies to reach the army. In a phone call with Israeli ambassador Simha Dinitz, Kissinger told the ambassador that the destruction of the Egyptian Third Army is an option that does not exist. The Israeli government also had its own motivations for not destroying the Third Army. These included the possibility of using the encircled Third Army as a bargaining chip for ending the Egyptian blockade of the Bab el-Mandeb Straits in the Red Sea and negotiating a repatriation of Israeli prisoners of war captured by Egypt. The exhausted state of the Israel Defense Forces, the possibility that humiliating Egypt by destroying the Third Army would make Sadat more bellicose and unwilling to cease hostilities, and Israel's intense fears that the Soviet Union would militarily intervene in the event the Third Army was destroyed were additional reasons for Israel ultimately deciding against destroying it. Despite being surrounded, the Third Army managed to maintain its combat integrity east of the canal and keep up its defensive positions, to the surprise of many. According to Trevor N. DePie, the Israelis, Soviets and Americans overestimated the vulnerability of the Third Army at the time. It was not on the verge of collapse, and he wrote that while a renewed Israeli offensive would probably overcome it, this was not a certainty. David T. Buckwalter agrees that despite the isolation of the Third Army, it was unclear if the Israelis could have protected their forces on the west bank of the canal from a determined Egyptian assault and still maintain sufficient strength along the rest of the front. This assessment was challenged by Patrick Seal, who stated that the Third Army was on the brink of collapse. Seal's position was supported by P.R. Kumaraswamy, who wrote that intense American pressure prevented the Israelis from annihilating the stranded Third Army. Herzog noted that given the Third Army's desperate situation, in terms of being cut off from resupply and reassertion of Israeli air superiority, the destruction of the Third Army was inevitable and could have been achieved within a very brief period. Shazli himself described the Third Army's plight as desperate, and classified its encirclement as a catastrophe that was too big to hide. He further noted that, the fate of the Egyptian Third Army was in the hands of Israel. Once the Third Army was encircled by Israeli troops, every bit of bread to be sent to our men was paid for by meeting Israeli demands. Shortly before the ceasefire came into effect, an Israeli tank battalion advanced into Adabiyah, and took it with support from the Israeli Navy. Some 1,500 Egyptian prisoners were taken, and about 100 Egyptian soldiers assembled just south of Adabiyah, where they held out against the Israelis. The Israelis also conducted their third and final incursion into Suez. They made some gains, but failed to break into the city center. As a result, the city was partitioned down the main street, with the Egyptians holding the city center and the Israelis controlling the outskirts, port installations and oil refinery, effectively surrounding the Egyptian defenders. By the end of the war, the Israelis had advanced to positions some 101 kilometers from Egypt's capital, Cairo, and occupied 1,600 square kilometers west of the Suez Canal. They had also cut the Cairo-Suez road and encircled the bulk of Egypt's Third Army. The Israelis had also taken many prisoners after Egyptian soldiers, including many officers, began surrendering in masses towards the end of the war. The Egyptians held a narrow strip on the east bank of the canal, occupying some 1,200 square kilometers of the Sinai. One source estimated that the Egyptians had 70,000 men, 720 tanks and 994 artillery pieces on the east bank of the canal. However, 30,000 to 45,000 of them were now encircled by the Israelis. Despite Israel's tactical successes west of the canal, the Egyptian military was reformed and organized. Consequently, according to Gamassi, the Israeli military position became weak, for different reasons. 1. Israel now had a large force in a very limited area of land, surrounded from all sides either by natural or man-made barriers, or by the Egyptian forces. This put it in a weak position. Moreover, there were the difficulties in supplying this force, in evacuating it, in the lengthy communication lines, and in the daily attrition in men and equipment. 2. To protect these troops, the Israeli command had to allocate other forces to defend the entrances to the breach at the Diversoir. 3. To immobilize the Egyptian bridgeheads in Sinai, the Israeli command had to allocate 10 brigades to face the 2nd and 3rd Army bridgeheads. In addition, it became necessary to keep the strategic reserves at their maximum state of alert. Thus, Israel was obliged to keep its armed force, and consequently the country, mobilized for a long period, at least until the war came to an end, because the ceasefire did not signal the end of the war. There is no doubt that this was in total conflict with its military theories. Egypt wished to end the war when it realized that the Israel Defense Forces canal-crossing offensive could result in a catastrophe. The Egyptians' besieged Third Army could not hold on without supply. The Israeli army advanced to 100 kilometers from Cairo, which worried Egypt. The Israeli army had open terrain and no opposition to advance further to Cairo. Had they done so, Sadat's rule might have ended.
In the Golan Heights, the Syrians attacked 2 Israeli armored brigades, an infantry brigade, 2 paratrooper battalions and 11 artillery batteries with 5 divisions and 188 batteries. At the onset of the battle, the Israeli brigades of some 3,000 troops, 180 tanks and 60 artillery pieces faced off against 3 infantry divisions with large armor components comprising 28,000 Syrian troops, 800 tanks and 600 artillery pieces. In addition, the Syrians deployed 2 armored divisions from the second day onwards. To fight the opening phase of a possible battle, before reserves arrived, Israeli High Command had, conforming to the original plan, allocated a single armored brigade, the 188th, accepting a disparity in tank numbers of 18 to 1. When the warning by King Hussein of an imminent Syrian attack was conveyed, Elazar at first only assigned 2 additional tank companies from 7th Armored Brigade. "We'll have 100 tanks against their 800. That ought to be enough." Eventually, his deputy, Israel Tal, ordered the entire 7th Armored Brigade to be brought up. Efforts had been made to improve the Israeli defensive position. The Purple Line ran along a series of low dormant volcanic cones, telephones in the north and deep ravines in the south. It was covered by a continuous tank ditch, bunker complexes and dense minefields. Directly west of this line a series of tank ramps were constructed, earthen platforms on which a Centurion tank could position itself with only its upper turret and gun visible, offering a substantial advantage when dueling the fully exposed enemy tanks. The Syrians began their attack at 1400 with an airstrike by about 100 aircraft and a 50-minute artillery barrage. The 2 forward infantry brigades, with an organic tank battalion, of each of the 3 infantry divisions then crossed the ceasefire lines, bypassing United Nations observer posts. They were covered by mobile anti-aircraft batteries, and equipped with bulldozers to fill in anti-tank ditches, bridge layer tanks to overcome obstacles and mine clearance vehicles. These engineering vehicles were priority targets for Israeli tank gunners and took heavy losses, but Syrian infantry at points demolished the tank ditch, allowing their armor to cross. At 1445, 200 men from the Syrian 82nd Paratrooper Battalion descended on foot from Mount Hermon and around 1700 took the Israeli observation base on the southern slope, with its advanced surveillance equipment. A small force dropped by 4 helicopters simultaneously placed itself on the access road south of the base. Specialized intelligence personnel were captured. Made to believe that Israel had fallen, they disclosed much sensitive information. A first Israeli attempt on the 8th of October to retake the base from the south was ambushed and beaten off with heavy losses. During the afternoon 7th Armored Brigade was still kept in reserve and the 188th Armored Brigade held the front line with only 2 tank battalions, the 74th in the north and the 53rd in the south. The Northern Battalion waged an exemplary defensive battle against the forward brigades of the Syrian 7th Infantry Division, destroying 59 Syrian tanks for minimal losses. The Southern Battalion destroyed a similar number, but facing 4 Syrian tank battalions from 2 divisions had a dozen of its own tanks knocked out. At Bunker Complex 111, opposite Qudni in Syria, the defending company beat off, determined, and, bravely, pressed attacks by the Syrian 9th Infantry Division. By nightfall it was reduced to 3 tanks, with only 69 anti-tank rounds between them. Further successful resistance by the Southern Battalion was contingent on reinforcements. Direct operational command of the Golan had at first been given to the 188 AB commander, Yitzhak ben Shoham, who ordered the 7th AB to concentrate at Wasit. The 7th AB commander, Avigdor ben Gal, resented obeying an officer of equal rank and went to the Northern Command headquarters at Naffa, announcing he would place his force in the northern sector at the Quneitra Gap, a pass south of the Hermonot Peak and the main access to the Golan Heights from the east. Northern Command was in the process of moving their headquarters to Safed in Galilee, and the senior staff officers were absent at this moment, having expected the Syrian attack to start at 1800. Operations Officer Lieutenant Colonel Uri Simoni therefore improvised an allocation of the tactical reserves, thereby largely deciding the course of the battle. The Armored School Centurion Tank Battalion, 71st TB, was kept in general reserve. The 77th Tank Battalion of 7th AB was sent to Quneitra. 2 companies of the 75th Mechanized Infantry Battalion, arrived in the morning, of the same brigade were sent to the southern sector. Also 82nd TB had to reinforce the south. However, Ben Gal had split off a company of this battalion to serve as a reserve for his own brigade. Another company, soon after arriving in the south, was ambushed by an infiltrated Syrian commando force armed with Sagar missiles and almost entirely wiped out. As a result, effective reinforcement of the southern Golan sector was limited to just a single tank company. At 1600, Yitzhak Hofi, head Northern Command, shortly visited Naffa and split command of the Golan Front. The north would be the responsibility of 7th AB, to which 53rd TB would be transferred. Command of 188th AB would be limited to the south, taking over 82nd TB. The first wave of the Syrian offensive had failed to penetrate, but at nightfall a second, larger, wave was launched. For this purpose each of the 3 infantry divisions, also committing their organic mechanized brigade with 40 tanks, had been reinforced by an armored brigade of about 90 tanks. 2 of these brigades were to attack the northern sector, 4 the southern sector.
Over 4 days of fighting, the 7th Armored Brigade in the north under Avigdor ben Gal managed to hold the Rocky Hill Line defending the northern flank of their headquarters in Naffa, inflicting heavy losses on the Syrians. During the night of the 6th or the 7th of October it beat off an attack of the Syrian 78th Armored Brigade, attached to the 7th Infantry Division. On the 7th of October, 7th AB had to send part of its reserves to the collapsing southern sector. Replenishment from the Naffa materiel stock became impossible. Syrian High Command, understanding that forcing the Quneitra Gap would ensure a total victory on the Golan, decided to commit its strategic armored reserves. During the night of the 7th or the 8th of October, the independent 81st Armored Brigade, equipped with modern T-62s and part of the Presidential Guard, attacked but was beaten off. After this fight, the Israeli brigade would refer to the gap as the Valley of Tears. Syrian Brigadier General Omar Abrash, commander of the 7th Infantry Division, was killed on the 8th of October when his command tank was hit as he was preparing an attempt by 121st Mechanized Brigade to bypass the gap through a more southern route. Having practiced on the Golan Heights numerous times, Israeli gunners made effective use of mobile artillery. During night attacks, however, the Syrian tanks had the advantage of active illumination infrared night vision equipment, which was not a standard Israeli equipment. Instead, some Israeli tanks were fitted with large xenon searchlights which were useful in illuminating and locating enemy positions, troops and vehicles. The close distances during night engagements negated the usual Israeli superiority in long-range duels. 77th Tank Battalion Commander Avigdor Kahalani in the Quneitra Gap generally managed to hold a second tank ramp line. In the afternoon of the 9th of October, Syrian command committed the Republican Guard Independent 70th Armored Brigade, equipped with T-62s and BMP-1s. To hold the gap, 7th AB could by now muster only some 24 tanks, elements from the 77th, 74th, 82nd and 71st Tank Battalion. Israeli command had directed all reserves to the threatened southern sector, trusting that the northern sector was secure. Fighting in daylight proved to be advantageous to the Syrians. The better armored T-62s were hard to destroy at long range, and their high-velocity 115mm U-5TS smoothbore guns were quite accurate at medium ranges, despite the lack of a rangefinder. Taking losses and hit by an intense artillery barrage, the Israeli Centurions withdrew from their tank ramps. The situation was restored by an ad hoc force of 13 tanks formed by Lieutenant Colonel Yossi Ben Hanan from repaired vehicles and stray crews. The Syrians abandoned their last breakthrough attempt, having lost since the 6th of October some 260 tanks in the Quneitra Gap. In the southern sector, the Israeli Barak Armored Brigade had to defend a much flatter terrain. It also faced two-thirds of the Syrian second wave, while fielding at this time less than a third of the operational Israeli tanks. Beside these objective drawbacks, it suffered from ineffective command. Ben Shoham initially still had his headquarters in Naffa, far from his sector. He did not realize a full war was in progress and tended to spread the 53rd TB platoons along the entire line, to stop any Syrian incursion. Also, he failed to coordinate the deployment of 82nd TB and 53rd TB. The commander of 53rd TB, Lieutenant Colonel Oded Ares, sent the two arriving companies of 82nd TB to his right flank and center. No further reinforcement materializing, he urgently ordered the southern company to the north again. It was ambushed on the way. His left flank at Qudni remained unreinforced, although the defending company had increased the number of operational tanks to 8. This was the main axis of the Syrian 9th Infantry Division, and its commander, Colonel Hassan Torkmani, ordered the remnants of an organic tank battalion to be sacrificed, forcing the minefield belt. Subsequently, the Syrian 51st Armored Brigade bypassed Bunker Complex 111 after dark. It then overran the Israeli supply compound at the Hushnaya crossroads. Parts of the 75th Mechanized Infantry Battalion had been concentrated at Hushnaya, but they did not consist of its two organic tank companies. They were M113 units. Lacking modern anti-tank weapons, Israeli infantry was ineffective at stopping Syrian armor. The 51st AB, passing through the Qudni-Rafid Gap, turned northwest to move along the Petroleum Road or Taplin Road, which provided a diagonal route across the heights, running straight from Hushnaya to Naffa, the Israeli Golan headquarters, in the rear of the Quneitra Gap. Israeli command was initially slow to realize that a breakthrough had taken place. Their main concern was that the Syrians would occupy some forward bunker complex or settlement. The fact that the defending tank platoons were still intact was seen as proof that the line had not been broken. Ben Shoham around 1830 moved his headquarters to the south. Reports of Syrian radio traffic at Hushnaya, of Israeli reserve tanks passing columns of Syrian tanks in the dark and of enemy tanks moving at the rear of the observation post on Telephone Sake, were dismissed by him as misidentifications. Only when two tanks parked in the dark near his staff vehicles and were recognized for T-55s when hastily driving away upon being hailed, he understood that a large Syrian tank unit had infiltrated his lines. As a result, no regular units were directed to block a Syrian advance to Naffa. Ben Shoham had ordered Lieutenant Spika Greengold, who, about to be trained as a tank company commander, had arrived at Naffa unattached to any combat unit, to gather some crews and follow him to the south with a few tanks to take command of the bunker complex 111 and 112 tank forces which had lost all officers. 5 kilometers south of Naffa base, Greengold was warned by a truck convoy that there were Syrian tanks ahead. These belonged to the 452 Stone Tank Battalion, hurrying north to surprise Naffa. Confronted at short range with a first group of 3 T-55s, Greengold's Centurion destroyed them in quick succession. He then moved parallel to the road to the south, hitting advancing Syrian tanks in the flank and destroying another 10 until he approached Hashnaya. From this, the commander of 452 Stone TB, Major Farouk Ismail, concluded that he had been ambushed by a strong Israeli tank unit and concentrated his remaining vehicles in a defensive position at Hashnaya. Greengold decided not to reveal how precarious the Israeli situation was, in radio contact with Ben Shoham, hiding the fact that his force Spika consisted of only a single tank. The next 9th Infantry Division unit to participate in the second wave, the 43rd Mechanized Infantry Brigade, entered the Golan at Kudni, but then sharply turned to the right, advancing over the lateral, Reshit Road behind the Purple Line in the direction of Quneitra. Israeli 1st Infantry Brigade elements warned 7th Armored Brigade of the danger. Ben Gal then released the 82nd TB Company he had held back, commanded by Captain Mayer, Tiger, Zamir, and sent it to the south to cover his flank. Zamir ambushed the Syrian brigade, directing their fire with the xenon light projector on one of his tanks. His company destroyed a dozen vehicles. At dawn, he surprised the enemy column from the rear and dispersed the remnants of 43 MIB, having knocked out all of its 40 tanks. Around midnight, Hofi, at Safed, began to understand the magnitude of the Syrian breakthrough. He warned Chief of Staff Elazar that the entire Golan might be lost. Overhearing this message, an alarmed Dayan decided to personally visit the Northern Command headquarters. In the late night, Hofi informed Dayan that an estimated 300 Syrian tanks had entered the Southern Golan. No reserves were available to stop a Syrian incursion into Galilee. Visibly shaken by this news, the Israeli Minister of Defense ordered the Jordan bridges to be prepared for detonation. Next, he contacted Benjamin Peld, commander of the Israeli Air Force. He shocked Peld by announcing that the Third Temple was about to fall. The Israeli Air Force had just made a successful start with Operation Tagar, a very complex plan to neutralize the Egyptian missile belt. Overruling objections by Peld, Dayan ordered to immediately carry out Operation Dugman 5 instead, the destruction of the Syrian Sam belt, to allow the Israeli Air Force to halt the Syrian advance. As there was no time to obtain recent information on the location of the batteries, the attempt was a costly failure. The Israelis destroyed only one Syrian missile battery but lost 6 Phantom II aircraft. As a result, the Israeli Air Force was unable to make a significant contribution to the defensive battle on the Golan. Over both fronts together, on the 7th of October only 129 bombardment sorties were flown. It also proved impossible to restart Tagar, curtailing Israeli Air Force operations on the Sinai front for the duration of the war. Less pessimistic than Dayan, Elazar was not ready yet to abandon the Golan Heights. Israeli High Command had a strategic reserve, consisting of the 146th UGDA that was earmarked for Central Command, controlling the eastern border with Jordan. In the evening of the 6th of October, Elazar had considered sending this division to the collapsing Sinai front in view of the initial defensive success at the Golan. The unexpected crisis led to an about-face. Priority was given to the north, because of its proximity to Israeli population centers at Tiberias, Safed, Haifa and Netanya. Elazar ordered that, after mobilization, the 146th UGDA was to reconquer the Southern Golan. This division would take some time to deploy. Some smaller units could be quickly mobilized to bolster the defenses. The Syrians had expected it to take at least 24 hours for Israeli reserves to reach the front lines. In fact, they began to join the fight only 9 hours after the war began, 12 hours after the start of the mobilization. The Golan position had been at only 80% of its planned strength for the defensive phase of a full war with Syria. Northern Command had a headquarters reserve consisting of an unnumbered rapid deployment Centurion tank battalion. Also, the 71st Mechanized Infantry Battalion, with 2 organic tank companies, of the 188th AB had not yet been activated. During the night of the 6th or the 7th of October these 2 battalions were gradually brought up. Around 1 o'clock on the 7th of October, the 36th UGDA was activated as a divisional headquarters under Brigadier Raphael Eaton, to take direct command of the Northern Front. The 7th AB did not have this division as its original destination. It was an elite active General Headquarters Reserve, moved from the Sinai to the Golan in reaction to the Syrian buildup. Under the original mobilization plan Chak, the 36th UGDA was to be expanded by the 179th Armored Brigade. In the evening of the 6th of October, it was considered to send this brigade to the Sinai instead, but this option was abandoned after the Syrian breakthrough. To speed up the relocation of 7th AB to the north, this brigade had left its tanks at Tassa, the main mobilization complex of the Sinai, and used the stocked vehicles of the 179th AB to rebuild itself at Naffa. In turn, the 179th AB began to mobilize in eastern Galilee, from the mobilization complex at the foot of the Golan Heights, using the stocked vehicles of the 164th Armored Brigade. This latter brigade was earmarked for the 240th UGDA, a division to be held in reserve. Assuming that a sustained Syrian offensive would have led to crippling Arab tank losses, 36th UGDA and 240th UGDA were in the pre-war planning intended to execute an advance in the direction of Damascus, Operation Zeev Arabat, Desert Wolf. All remaining stocked Centurions in the north were eventually used to rebuild 7th and 188th AB in the night of the 9th or the 10th of October. The 164th AB was ultimately sent to the Sinai, to activate itself using the old 7th AB materiel. The 679th Armored Brigade was intended to join the 240th UGDA and ordered to mobilize at noon the 6th of October. Reservists of both brigades arriving at the Galilee Army depots were quickly assigned to tanks and sent to the front, without waiting for the crews they trained with to arrive, machine guns to be installed, or the tank guns to be calibrated, a time-consuming process known as bore sighting. Elements of such larger units were during the 7th of October fed into the battle piecemeal. The Syrian first and second wave had in total numbered about 600 tanks, half of which had been lost by the morning of the 7th of October. By this time, the Israelis had committed about 250 tanks to battle. Of the initially arriving reserves, the 71 MIB was used to block an advance by the westernmost elements of the Syrian 9th Infantry Division towards the Binat Yaakov Bridge, the crucial connection between Galilee and Naffa. During the late evening of the 6th of October, the NCTB advanced from Naffa towards Hushnaya, attempting to seal the breakthrough point. The attack, running into prepared positions occupied by a superior force of T-55s, was a dismal failure, leaving all of its officers dead or wounded. Greengold incorporated the remnants of the unit into his Force Spica. By the early morning of the 7th of October, all attempts to patch the breach in the main defensive line of the southern sector became futile because also the center and right flank of the 188th AB had started to collapse. During the night, it had largely managed to hold its ground against continuous attacks, inflicting severe losses on the Syrians with accurate cannon fire, hoping to buy time for reserve forces to reach the front lines. Some tank crews sacrificed themselves rather than voluntarily give ground. Gradually, the fighting subsided. Dawn revealed that the Syrian 5th Infantry Division under the cover of darkness had at numerous points bridged the tank ditch and cleared corridors through the minefield belt. The situation of 188th AB was rendered even more hazardous by the presence in its rear of the Syrian 9th Infantry Division. It was decided to abandon the Southern Golan. In the night, many artillery and logistic units had already withdrawn, some slipping through the columns of 9th ID, others being destroyed by them. Civilian Jewish settlements had been evacuated. The same now happened with most fortifications, except Bunker Complex 116. Ben Shoham with his staff outflanked the Syrian penetration via a western route and reached the north. The 82nd TB Company that had reinforced the center, commanded by Eli Jiva, had the previous evening destroyed about 30 Syrian tanks. It now successfully crossed the axis of 9th ID to the north. Of the originally 36 tanks of 53rd TB, 12 remained. Air race hid them in the crater of Telephone Ferris, where a surveillance base was located. During the late evening of the 7th of October, he would successfully break out to the west. The Syrian 5th ID subsequently occupied the plateau of the Southern Golan. Ben Shoham tried to maintain a foothold on the access roads by small groups of APCs manned by the 50th Paratrooper Battalion, but these were easily brushed aside. The Syrian 47th Armored Brigade advanced along the escarpment to the north, in the direction of the Bnat Yaakov Bridge. The 132nd Mechanized Infantry Brigade positioned itself east of El Al, on the road along the Jordan border, running to the south of Lake Tiberias. Israeli General Dan Lenner in the late night activated the divisional headquarters of the 210th UGDA to take control over the sector between the lake and the Bnat Yaakov Bridge, but he had no regular units to hold this line. For the moment, he could do little more than personally halt retreating troops and vehicles on the more southern Arak Bridge and send them over the River Jordan again. Israeli command feared that the Syrians would quickly exploit this situation by advancing into Galilee. Dayan in the morning of the 7th of October called Shalhavit Freyer, the Director General of the Israel Atomic Energy Commission, to a meeting with Golda Meir to discuss the possible arming of nuclear weapons. Meir rejected this option. The Syrian mechanized brigades in this area did not continue the offensive but began to entrench themselves in strong defensive positions. They had been forbidden by al-Assad to approach the River Jordan, for fear of triggering an Israeli nuclear response. The original Syrian offensive plan al-Awda, the return, devised by Major General Adul Habezi, had emphasized the element of tactical surprise. It was known to the Syrians that the 188th AB normally rotated its 2 tank battalions on the Purple Line, so that on any given moment just 33 tanks were guarding the tank ditch. Infiltration by commando teams armed with Sagers were planned to quickly isolate these 10 tank platoons from reinforcement by tactical reserves. Simultaneously, helicopter-borne commando attacks at the Jordan bridges, landing during conditions of dusk to avoid the Israeli Air Force, would isolate the Golan Heights from strategic reinforcements. Night attacks by the 3 Syrian infantry divisions would then fragment the weakly held forward Israeli defensive positions. To conclude the operation and deter any Israeli attempt to reconquer the Golan, the Syrian 1st and 3rd Armored Division would advance onto the plateau. This way, it was hoped to take the Golan within 30 hours. Coordination with Egypt forced a change of plans. The Egyptians wanted hostilities to start at noon. In the end, they agreed to a compromise time of 1400. The Syrian helicopter attacks were cancelled. Now uncertain of a successful outcome, the Syrians became less committed to the attack. They decided to keep 1 armored division as a strategic reserve, together with the 2 Presidential Guard independent armored brigades, which fielded the most modern tank materiel. The tide in the Golan began to turn as arriving Israeli reserve forces were able to contain the Syrian advance. Beginning on the 8th of October, the Israelis began pushing the Syrians back towards the pre-war ceasefire lines, inflicting heavy tank losses. The Israelis, who had suffered heavy casualties during the first 3 days of fighting, also began relying more heavily on artillery to dislodge the Syrians at long range. On the 9th of October, the Syrians launched a counterattack north of Quneitra. As part of the operation, they attempted to land heli-borne troops in the vicinity of El Ram. The counterattack was repulsed, and 4 Syrian helicopters were shot down with total loss of life. Syrian Frog 7 artillery rockets struck the Israeli Air Force base of Ramat David, killing a pilot and injuring several soldiers. Additional missiles struck civilian settlements. In retaliation, 7 Israeli F-4 Phantoms flew into Syria and struck the Syrian General Staff headquarters in Damascus. 1 Israeli Phantom was shot down. The strike prompted the Syrians to transfer air defense units from the Golan Heights to the home front, allowing the Israeli Air Force greater freedom of action. By the 10th of October, the last Syrian unit in the central sector was pushed back across the Purple Line, the pre-war ceasefire line. After 4 days of intense and incessant combat, the Israelis had succeeded in ejecting the Syrians from the entire Golan. A decision now had to be made, whether to stop at the post-1967 border or to continue advancing into Syrian territory. The Israeli High Command spent all of the 10th of October debating well into the night. Some favored disengagement, which would allow soldiers to be redeployed to the Sinai. Shmuel Ganon's defeat at Hazayan in the Sinai had taken place 2 days earlier. Others favored continuing the attack into Syria, towards Damascus, which would knock Syria out of the war. It would also restore Israel's image as the supreme military power in the Middle East and would give Israel a valuable bargaining chip once the war ended. Others countered that Syria had strong defenses, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and strongpoints, and that it would be better to fight from defensive positions in the Golan Heights in the event of another war with Syria. However, Prime Minister Golda Meir realized the most crucial point of the whole debate. It would take 4 days to shift a division to the Sinai. If the war ended during this period, the war would end with a territorial loss for Israel in the Sinai and no gain in the north, an unmitigated defeat. This was a political matter and her decision was unmitigating, to cross the Purple Line. The attack would be launched tomorrow, Thursday the 11th of October. On the 11th of October, Israeli forces pushed into Syria and advanced towards Damascus along the Quneitra-Damascus road until the 14th of October, encountering stiff resistance by Syrian reservists in prepared defenses. 3 Israeli divisions broke the 1st and 2nd defensive lines near Sasa, and conquered a further 50 square kilometers of territory in the Bashan salient. From there, they were able to shell the outskirts of Damascus, only 40 kilometers away, using M107 heavy artillery. The Israeli army advanced to within 30 kilometers of Damascus. On the 12th of October, Israeli paratroopers from the elite Sayeret Zaanannim reconnaissance unit launched Operation Gown, infiltrating deep into Syria and destroying a bridge in the tri-border area of Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. The operation disrupted the flow of weapons and troops to Syria. During the operation, the paratroopers destroyed a number of tank transports and killed several Syrian soldiers. There were no Israeli casualties.
Jordanian forces entered Syria and have been heavily engaged in action throughout yesterday.
As the Syrian position deteriorated, Jordan sent an expeditionary force into Syria. King Hussein, who had come under intense pressure to enter the war, told Israel of his intentions through U.S. intermediaries, in the hope that Israel would accept that this was not a casus belli justifying an attack on Jordan. Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan declined to offer any such assurance, but said that Israel had no intention of opening another front. Iraq also sent an expeditionary force to Syria, consisting of the 3rd and 6th Armored Divisions, some 30,000 men, 250 to 500 tanks, and 700 APCs. Israeli jets attacked Iraqi forces as they arrived in Syria. The Iraqi divisions were a strategic surprise for the Israel Defense Forces, which had expected 24-hour-plus advance intelligence of such moves. This turned into an operational surprise, as the Iraqis attacked the exposed southern flank of the advancing Israeli armor, forcing its advance units to retreat a few kilometers in order to prevent encirclement. Combined Syrian, Iraqi and Jordanian counterattacks prevented any further Israeli gains. However, they were unable to push the Israelis back from the Bashan salient, and suffered heavy losses in their engagements with the Israelis. The most effective attack took place on the 20th of October, though Arab forces lost 120 tanks in that engagement. The Syrian Air Force attacked Israeli columns, but its operations were highly limited because of Israeli air superiority, and it suffered heavy losses in dogfights with Israeli jets. On the 23rd of October, a large air battle took place near Damascus during which the Israelis shot down 10 Syrian aircraft. The Syrians claimed a similar toll against Israel. The Israel Defense Forces also destroyed the Syrian missile defense system. The Israeli Air Force utilized its air superiority to attack strategic targets throughout Syria, including important power plants, petrol supplies, bridges and main roads. The strikes weakened the Syrian war effort, disrupted Soviet efforts to airlift military equipment into Syria, and disrupted normal life inside the country. On the 22nd of October, the Golani Brigade and Sayeret Matkal commandos recaptured the outpost on Mount Hermon, after a hard-fought battle that involved hand-to-hand combat and Syrian sniper attacks. An unsuccessful attack 2 weeks prior had cost the Israelis 23 dead and 55 wounded and the Syrians 29 dead and 11 wounded, while the second attack cost Israel an additional 55 dead and 79 wounded. An unknown number of Syrians were also killed and some were taken prisoner. An Israel Defense Forces D-9 bulldozer supported by infantry forced its way to the peak. An Israeli paratroop force landing by helicopter took the corresponding Syrian Hermon outposts on the mountain, killing more than a dozen Syrians while losing 1 dead and 4 wounded. 7 Syrian MiGs and 2 Syrian helicopters carrying reinforcements were shot down as they attempted to intercede. . ' On the 22nd of October, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 338 calling for a ceasefire. Following the UN-backed ceasefire, there were ongoing artillery exchanges and skirmishes, and Israeli forces continued to occupy positions deep within Syria. Some aerial engagements took place, and both sides lost several aircraft. Amid mounting international pressure and further UN resolutions calling for a ceasefire, the war finally came to a close on the 26th of October. Israel and Egypt signed a formal ceasefire agreement on the 11th of November, and this was followed with a disengagement agreement on the 18th of January the next year. Hostilities between Israel and Syria continued, and on the 4th of February 1974, 500 Cubans joined a Syrian tank division at Mount Hermon in an attack against Israeli forces, sparking a war of attrition in the Golan Heights. It ended only in the 31st of May with a ceasefire between Israel and Syria. The war saw the largest naval confrontation between the United States Navy and Soviet Navy of the entire Cold War. As the United States and Soviet Union supported their respective allies, their fleets in the Mediterranean became increasingly hostile toward each other. The Soviet 5th Operational Squadron had 52 ships in the Mediterranean when the war began, including 11 submarines, some of which carried cruise missiles with nuclear warheads. The United States 6th Fleet had 48, including 2 aircraft carriers, a helicopter carrier, and amphibious vessels carrying 2,000 Marines. As the war continued, both sides reinforced their fleets. The Soviet squadron grew to 97 vessels including 23 submarines, while the U.S. 6th Fleet grew to 60 vessels including 9 submarines, 2 helicopter carriers, and 3 aircraft carriers. Both fleets made preparations for war, and U.S. aircraft conducted reconnaissance over the Soviet fleet. The two fleets began to disengage following the ceasefire. In response to U.S. support of Israel, the Arab members of OPEC, led by King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, decided to reduce oil production by 5% per month on the 17th of October. On the 19th of October, President Nixon authorized a major allocation of arms supplies and $2.2 billion in appropriations for Israel. In response, Saudi Arabia declared an embargo against the United States, later joined by other oil exporters and extended against the Netherlands and other countries, causing the 1973 energy crisis.